Hi everybody, I'm Susan Mulvihill. Welcome back to our vegetable garden in Spokane, Washington, where the hardiness zone ranges from 5B to 6A. I've been getting a lot of requests lately for a video on planting a fall garden, and I love that idea, so that is today's topic. I've got a lot of information to share with you. I'm going to talk about the time frame for starting your plants. I'm going to give you a whole bunch of crop recommendations and even varieties. And I'm going to talk about soil prep so that your plants get off to a great start. But first, let's talk about why you would even want to plant a fall garden. If you're like me, you want to get as much produce out of the garden as possible. And growing a fall garden is a great way to do that. Now, a lot of you might be saying, golly, we had just a crazy garden season, and when the frosts come, I want to just hang up my trowel and call it good. Well, if you would like to garden when there's less challenges, then a fall garden is for you. If you're like me and you've been experiencing a very challenging growing season, there are some crops that we normally would have a bounty of and we don't. So I want to fill in that gap and try to resolve that problem by planting more crops. And another thing to think about is that when you grow a fall garden, there tend to be less insects about. So that's one less challenge to deal with. The first thing I want you to do is to figure out how much time you have before the fall frosts arrive. Although keep in mind that I am going to suggest a lot of cool season crops that are particularly frost tolerant, so that buys you even more time. But here in Spokane, it is the end of July, and our first frost typically tends to be near the end of September. So that gives me about 63 days. And as you'll see by the crops I'm about to recommend to you, that time frame works just right. I made a chart so I could give you some suggestions for crops that would do well either for a late season crop or a fall garden crop. They're organized by the name of the crop, how many days it takes them to reach maturity, and whether they're frost tolerant or not. And I also have a few varieties to recommend to you. So first up is Arugula. I've grown Esme with great success. And this day range here refers to harvesting baby leaves versus mature leaves. You might consider bush beans if you have enough time. We actually have a late crop of Contender bush beans in the garden right now, and they're doing great. They need about 50 days to reach maturity. I love growing beets, and Cylindra is one of my favorites. They need 60 days to reach maturity, and they are frost tolerant, so we should be able to pull that off. You can consider growing broccoli, and perhaps Belstar, which is my current favorite. They need 65 to 70 days, and yes, they are frost tolerant, so you probably can get away with it. Carrots. I'm going to grow short stuff Chantenay and Scarlet Nantes. They need 65 to 75 days, and because they are frost tolerant, I should be able to pull that off. What about kale? I'm recommending red Russian or blue curled Scotch. They take 60 days to reach maturity. Yes, they are very frost tolerant. And then there's lettuce. Lettuce is a great idea. So Bauer is one of my favorites. That has worked really well for us. Also red Romaine and Forellenschluss, which is a mouthful. But look, they just need 40 to 55 days to reach maturity. Pak choi. We have had good luck with Green Fortune and Bopak. They only need 45 days. They're very frost tolerant. And then there's peas. So I'm going to grow Cascadia. Super Sugar Snap is another suggestion. They need about 60 days to reach maturity, and they are frost tolerant. How about radishes? I'm going to plant some purple plum radishes. Red Planet is another idea, and look, they only need 30 days. That is always so cool. For spinach, you might consider growing Giant Winter or Catalina. They need 40 to 50 days. That's not much time at all. And I have a couple of super hardy ones that I'm going to tell you about in just a moment. And then Swiss chard, that's another idea. Either garden rainbow or rainbow blend. Those are really pretty in the garden, and they need 50 to 55 days to reach maturity. And you'll notice I have somewhat on here as far as frost tolerance goes. And then there's turnips, and what I'm referring to are the white crunchy turnips that you can eat like an apple, believe it or not the big old hard things that you get in the grocery store. This is Mikado, and it only needs 30 days to reach maturity, which is amazing. Or you might consider Silky Sweet. We've grown that one as well, and it is great. But in general, these types of turnips need 30 to 65 days to reach maturity. Now let's talk about super cold tolerant crops. You might consider growing corn salad or mush. That's what this is. I've grown it before, and it is incredibly cold tolerant. It needs 60 days to reach maturity. For lettuce, I have grown Batavian Full Heart, and that is another very cold tolerant variety of lettuce. It needs 30 to 45 days. Minutina, I don't have a picture of that for you, but this is something I grew quite a few years ago in our winter garden. It just needs 50 days to reach maturity. And then different types of spinach that are really cold tolerant, and those would be Matador, Monstru de Viroflay, or Butterfly. Just 43 days. Okay, now that I've given you some recommendations, what you want to do is look at the seed packets of what you want to grow and read if they need to be started ahead indoors or if you should direct sow them. So by direct sow, I mean putting the seeds directly out in the garden. And that will often apply to things that are root crops. So carrots, beets, radishes, turnips, all of those would be a direct sow vegetable. Look at the seed packet to see what the spacing and planting depth are. And then one thing I wanted to tell you is that we have some temperatures in the 90s and hundreds coming up. And so I know that if I plant my pea seeds out in the garden, they are not going to like that hot weather. So what I've done to try to be sneaky is I've started some of them indoors. I thought if I could give them a head start on growing, then as soon as the temperatures cool down a bit, I can plant them out in the garden. So you just have to kind of think ahead to what are the conditions in my garden, what's the weather doing, and if it's something that really prefers cooler weather, you need to wait a little bit. So it does require a little bit of planning, but it's so worth it to get more of a harvest out of your garden. Now I really wanted to be planting some seeds and seedlings with you today, but as I mentioned earlier, we have some very hot weather coming, so I need to get past that before I subject anything to any kind of weather. Let's talk about bed prep. This is one of two beds that I'm going to be using for my project. And the first thing you need to do is to remove any plant debris that was left over from whatever grew previously in the bed. Put that into your compost pile. You want to gently loosen the soil and to add in some nutrients. And that's because the previous crop will have depleted the soil of certain types of nutrients. The types of nutrients you add are dependent upon the type of crop you're going to grow. In this bed, I'm growing peas, lettuce, spinach, and pak choi. And those all require nitrogen. So what I did is I added in some organic composted chicken manure because that is a good source of nitrogen. The other bed is where I'm growing root crops. So beets, carrots, turnips, and radishes. And root crops require phosphorus. So what I did is I added in some bone meal. Now, if you're not familiar with how fertilizers work, all the packages have 3 numbers on the label. The first number indicates the percentage of nitrogen in the package. The second indicates the amount of phosphorus in the package. and the third is potassium. So if I want a high nitrogen fertilizer, I want that first number, which represents nitrogen, to be the highest. If in the case of root crops, I want a high phosphorus fertilizer, that's the middle number that you want to be the highest. For the most part, in the fall, you should have very few insect problems, but two particularly stand out. One would be cabbage worms and the other would be aphids. And any type of cabbage family crop, such as broccoli or kale, is very susceptible to those two insects. And what I do is, on this broccoli bed, I have some agricultural insect netting covering it, and it has a very fine mesh so it will keep out the adult cabbage butterfly or moth, and it will keep out aphids. You can also use floating row cover. And with either of those, what you need to do is support them over the crop using hoops perhaps. These ones are made with black poly sprinkler pipe. And you want to weigh down the edges around the perimeter of the bed because insects are sneaky and you don't want to leave them a spot to get in. But both of those would work really well. Now there's two last things I wanted to mention. One is monitor your plants frequently to make sure that they're doing okay. The next is to make sure you water your garden regularly and make sure that soil is lightly moist. As I always like to say, not sopping wet and not bone dry, so you want right in the middle. And then what about plant protection when it starts getting quite cold? Well, there's a couple of things you could use. One would be a heavier duty row cover that's called a frost blanket. And the other would be clear plastic sheeting that you would put on some hoops over the bed. Both of those will work well, but there's a couple things I want to mention. First of all, the heavier duty floating row cover does let less light through it because it's a heavier duty type of a cloth. So you might need to just put that on at night. The other thing is that with plastic sheeting, it can get pretty hot during the daytime. And so you might find that you need to vent the ends by opening them up during the day and then closing them down again at night. Okay, that's everything I wanted to share with you today about planting a fall garden. I hope it gave you some good ideas, especially about the different types of crops and varieties you might consider growing. You know, it's so worth it to do this because you get all sorts of extra produce that you wouldn't have had otherwise. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to put them in the description underneath this video on YouTube. I will answer. I am very good about doing that. And if you liked the video, hit that like button. If you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, please do, because I shoot a video every week and also short videos during the week. And that way you will know what's out right away. Thanks so much for watching today, everybody. Happy gardening.